listening to Awake in Relationship, a podcast about intimacy, community, and culture in a time of great change, with Silas Rose.
Hello and welcome. My name is Silas Rose, and this is episode 3 of Awake in Relationship. In today's episode, we're going to be chatting with Mel Cassidy, a relationship coach, speaker, and author living in Comox, BC, about ethical non-monogamy. So if you've ever struggled to maintain an intimate relationship, especially over long-term, you are likely not alone. In fact, statistics for marriage in particular, I think are around the 40% divorce rate for first-time marriages, which is quite discouraging to say the least. Perhaps the greatest challenge for those seeking long-term relationship is that we're only really given one roadmap, which we call, in this episode, the relationship escalator, aka monogamy. The relationship escalator describes this blueprint towards happiness where people hook up, they date, they eventually move in together, get a home, get married, have kids, and the story ends happily ever after. So monogamy comes with a set of agreements, both spoken and unspoken, that don't tend to change over time. And for many people, that provides a sense of comfort, stability, and security in the relationship. But for others, there can be a sense of stuckness and claustrophobia that comes with those agreements. So as many relationship experts will agree, that familiarity creates a tremendous amount of comfort, but it can also have the unfortunate side effect of killing passion in the relationship. And passion is the glue that kind of bonds people together. And without the physical intimacy, many couples find it very difficult to maintain connection over the long term. And for those that find it hard to stay on the relationship escalator and maintain those agreements, those set agreements, and the relationship ends in divorce or separation, or perhaps there's infidelity, the consequences tend to be pretty dire, and the fall is very dramatic. So what if there was actually an alternative to this one pathway, this one roadmap towards long-term relationships, where we could actually negotiate our agreements over time and open things up, creating more freedom, growth, and intimacy. And I know it sounds too good to be true, but that's exactly what we're going to be talking about in this episode with Mel Cassidy. So stay tuned. To introduce Mel, so Mel Cassidy is a relationship coach and educator living in Comox, BC. And her work has been presented in Elle Magazine and on Radio Canada, among other publications. And she's a regular speaker at conferences throughout the Northwest and beyond, including ConvergeCon and Base Coast. And she's also a fellow podcaster. And she has a lovely podcast called Masculinity, which delves into conversations around masculinity and relationship. So before, I just want to say welcome to Mel.
Thanks, Silas.
Thank you for being here. One of the things in terms of your bio is a relationship anarchist. And I'm wondering if you could kind of tell us a little bit more about what that means.
Yeah, for sure. I think I was always a relationship anarchist before I ever discovered the term. But as soon as I heard the term, well, actually, my first response was, that sounds awful. And then I started looking into what it actually means. So, relationship anarchy is more of a philosophy of how to approach relationships. And it's the antithesis of what you were describing there about that standard um, linear trajectory that society gives us that says, so society likes to say that the most important relationship you have has to be a sexual, romantic one,
Mm.
and it has to be exclusive and it has to be lifelong, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole bunch of meaning and expectation and obligation that gets heaped into that model of relating. And relationship anarchy is the antithesis, is the opposite. So in relationship anarchy, relationships are not exclusive. Necessarily.
Hmm.
Relationships are not prioritized based purely on sexual relationship or emotional relationship or romantic relationship. For people who identify with relationship anarchy, their relationships often are more like a vast field or garden of different relationships with lots of variety. And in these relationships, no one is obligated to any kinds of behaviors. This is one of the quintessential characteristics of relationship anarchy, I've come to realize, is that each person is autonomous and the relationship is something that you co-create together.
Mm.
So rather than in society where, people might run into difficulty in their relationship and go to a counselor or advisor or spiritual guide, and the person will say, well, you're supposed to do this and you should do this. In relationship anarchy, we look at it and go, well, what's actually true for you? What is it that you need? And what is it your partner needs? And where do those needs align? And where they don't align, how do you address that in a way that feels good for everyone involved?
Hmm. So I get the sense that community and communication play pretty heavy into this model.
Absolutely. I think there's a lot of people who've heard this term relationship anarchy, especially as it's become more common in the last few years, and they kind of run with the anarchy piece of it. Um, and I think that that's more like a kind of libertarianism. The way that some people do it is they want to be very isolated and alone, and overtly autonomous.
Hmm.
But for me, relationship anarchy, where I've seen it function best and where I've experienced it being the healthiest, is when it does exist within community and a vast extended network of connections.
Hmm. So it's not about bomb throwing.
No.
No, it is disruptive for sure. It's
Well,
disrupting a model, that's for sure.
it definitely kind of smashes the patriarchy and a lot of concepts that people will base their whole lives on. So that's where the anarchy piece definitely comes in.
Nice. So today's discussion is about ethical non-monogamy, which, I think is something I first discovered perhaps through Esther Perel and in the book The Ethical Slut. I'm wondering how you would define this term.
Mm. Well, I to be honest, I find the terminology of ethical kind of problematic.
Hmm.
I didn't grow up in Canada. I grew up in the Middle East. My mother was Greek Venezuelan. And so I grew up with a lot of different cultural influences. And one of the things that I took away from that upbringing is that what is ethical in one culture is different from what's ethical in another culture. And so when we talk about what is ethically accepted or ethically acceptable
Mm.
within relationships, that varies from culture to culture and from time period to time period. I mean, there are places and times in the world where the ethical way of doing non-monogamy was to have a partner who was your spouse and the person you raised children with, but you could absolutely have lovers outside of that. And if you were a man, you could have mistresses and you would give them an allowance and have a house for them and so on and so forth. That
Hmm.
was ethical non-monogamy. We might look at that today and say that that's not ethical non-monogamy. So defining it as being ethical, I find problematic just because it's very context dependent.
Hmm.
Um, having lived in the Middle East, non-monogamy does still happen in the Middle East.
Mm.
Polygamous relationships, they're more frowned upon now because of the Western influence and the political pressures from there. But it does still happen. There are still plural marriages, and that's a different kind of non-monogamy. We might look at that in the West and go, well, that's subjugating women and et cetera, but we don't actually know what those people's lived experiences are unless we go and talk to them.
Mm-hmm.
So I prefer using the term honest non-monogamy.
Mm.
The term that is now being used more in psychology and counseling field, which I think is very useful, is consensual non-monogamy. So if you
Mm-hmm.
go and look up psychology studies and papers in that realm, they will refer to something called CNM, consensual non-monogamy. So
Mm.
that's the official terminology that's starting to come into play more. And I think both honest non-monogamy and consensual non-monogamy are more universally applicable.
Mm-hmm.
And I think more interesting to explore as a term, because one could be doing relationships in a non-monogamous style and not informing everybody about the other relationships, and could justify that as being ethical because it's less harmful to
Mm-hmm.
the people involved if they don't know.
Mm.
And I've definitely seen people do that, which is one of the reasons why I shy away from the term.
So, many of the listeners might be familiar with this notion of polyamory,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm kind of wondering how is there a difference?
I'd say that, consensual non-monogamy is this big umbrella of different ways of doing non-monogamy. And that includes polyamory, but it's not limited to polyamory. Polyamory is defined as multiple loving relationships with the full knowledge and consent of all involved.
Mm-hmm.
And that's different from swinging, for example. In swinging, you're having multiple sexual relationships with the knowledge of all people involved, presumably, um, but they're not necessarily romantically entangled relationships. These are not necessarily people that you're going to take home to introduce to the rest of your family, at holiday season.
Mm-hmm.
You're not necessarily looking to move in with them or to create a life path with them. You may not take vacations together, although you might go to like swinging retreats together. So, and it's not to say that someone can't be polyamorous and also be a swinger. That definitely happens, and there is definitely overlap. But I think that it's important we look at them as separate phenomenon, because well, one of the things that I've seen happen is that people start to use polyamory as an identity, and then it gets confusing
Mm.
because their actions are not actually in alignment with the intentions behind polyamory. And the
Mm-hmm.
main intention behind polyamory is that you are looking to create relationships with a big R. Now, that doesn't necessarily have to look like moving in together and
Mm-hmm.
sharing finances and so on and so forth. There are many, many people who do polyamory from more of a solo standpoint, but that doesn't mean that they're not moving into levels of commitment and deep emotional relating with their partners.
Hmm. So, as someone that's into honest non-monogamy, would you say that you are anti-monogamy? Like, if you were to kind of levy a criticism or sort of kind of present a challenge to the listener, what are some of the big challenges you see with monogamous relationships, and how can this potentially kind of offer some solutions to even saving a marriage or a long-term relationship?
Mm. Well, I'm not anti-monogamy. I think that monogamy is what works for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
We wouldn't have all this structure around it if it didn't work for people. Monogamy is an incredible strategy for creating safety, security, and stability in one's life.
Mm-hmm.
And for some people, it's a strategy that works, and for some people, it's a strategy that doesn't work for them. But it is certainly one pathway to creating that, and that's something that all of us as human beings need.
Mm-hmm.
Um, where I think that people will run into challenges in monogamous relationships is exactly the same places that people run into challenges with non-monogamous relationships. Interestingly enough, it's in the mythology that we've been fed around what a monogamous relationship is supposed to mean and what
Mm.
that's supposed to look like. So there's these I call them the fairy tale mythologies around one day my prince will come, and that there's one true soulmate out there for you. And we can get fixated on these stories to the point that we actually suffocate the authentic expression of our relationships.
Mm-hmm.
I see a lot of people fall into monogamous dynamics uh, by starting off with a sexual chemistry spark or an aesthetic attraction that's mutual. And people dive right in and go, okay, well, this is amazing. This is incredible. Now we're a thing. And then it's only over time that they start to develop the actual degrees of emotional intimacy and safety and erotic intimacy and safety and so forth that you need to be able to understand what is real between two people.
Mm.
And that's why we see a lot of monogamous relationships, at around the 5-year or 7-year mark. Statistically speaking, that's when a lot of couples will start to go into therapy or start looking at opening up, or
Mm-hmm.
perhaps they'll divorce, or perhaps they'll have an affair. It's usually around that period of time because that's when they're starting to wake up to the reality of who their partner is and who they are and where the disconnect between them is.
Mm-hmm.
And in the way that modern Western society encourages us to do monogamy, there isn't a lot of room for non-intimate relationships that are as significant as your sexually intimate relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by that, and I think that's more so for people who've been socialized as men, um, which is a whole other phenomenon that I could talk about at length. But
Mm-hmm.
um, we're taught to prioritize our romantic partner above all other friendships. So people will talk about, when their friend gets married, they never see their friend again, or from then on, you can only hang out with your friend if you've got your partner with you as well. Um,
Yeah,
so
that's
there,
part of the unspoken agreements that we talked about earlier.
Yeah, it's like you no longer are an individual. You're tied to this other person. It always reminds me of the two-headed monster in Sesame Street,
Mm-hmm.
where they would, one part of the body would finish the other part's sentences and so
Yeah.
forth.
Our
And
version of that would be kind of matching tracksuits.
yeah, yeah, they start dressing alike. And that it can be really adorable and endearing, and sometimes that just happens over the course of a very long-term relationship. But the loss of individual identity that is encouraged in modern relationships, I think, is very troubling. And so taking a step out of that, whether that is opening up a relationship or one person cheating in the relationship
Mm-hmm.
or breaking up, those are all actions that are geared around trying to reclaim the individual self.
Mm. Yeah, and again, Esther Perel talks a lot about that in terms of her work around infidelity.
Yeah, society can be very punishing when you fall off that relationship escalator.
Mm.
So this concept of the relationship escalator is that default trajectory
Yeah.
of how monogamous relationships are supposed to go. Um, and there's a lot of shame that comes up when you fall off that. I mean, I was married. I was on that trajectory for many
Mm.
years and then stepped off that escalator and separated and got divorced. And I definitely experienced from other people this very confusing degree of pity,
Mm.
which didn't match up with my inner experience, because to me it was very empowering to make that decision.
Mm.
And but people would have this pity, or people would get angry at my ex, and I'm like, there's nothing to be angry about. He was a decent person, we just were incompatible. And so there's a lot of social stigma about stepping off that escalator, and this idea that separation or infidelity has to be something that destroys everything.
Mm-hmm.
I think that idea is what's destructive, and it does not have to be. There's a really fantastic book called The New Monogamy, and I can't remember right now who the author is, but in it they talk about how acts of infidelity can actually become opportunities to recreate the relationship. And they talk about lots of different ways that you can go about reforming your understanding of what your relationship is and your agreements together.
Mm-hmm.
And for some people, that can include having an open relationship. But I don't think that open relationships are the solution to
Mm.
problems. I mean, if you're having difficulty relating to one person, and you think that relating to more people is going to be easier, then we need to sit down and do a little bit of math. Because it is definitely not easier. It requires exponentially more work and self-examination and more communication,
Yeah.
and it can be a lot harder to schedule. And if it is actually the right fit for you, it's going to feel great. But if non-monogamy is not the right fit for you, then it's just going to feel like it's going to feel exhausting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think speaking as a man, there's a certain fantasy element that's quite appealing. But yeah, then there's the day after, or the month after, uh, the hangover quality that actually you talk about in your work.
And there's some interesting research around people's desires and the degree to which we will fantasize about things versus acting on it or creating that as our actual life. There's a wonderful little meme that's been going around that I've seen recently that is an image of three people together in a bed, and they're spooning under the blankets. And the quote is something like, "This is how I want my life to be this year," or something along those lines. And I saw it shared in one polyamory group, and the responses were hilarious because everybody was going, "Wow, it gets so hot being in the middle. How does that guy have a blanket over him? Isn't he sweating? Oh my God, this is so unrealistic." And like, only in a king size bed, or like, where did the pets sleep? And it was so wonderful to see this thread, because to me it showed there's this kind of disconnect between the fantasy that is there in our collective subconscious
Mm-hmm.
versus the reality that some people live.
Mm-hmm.
And while I think a lot of people do start exploring different kinds of consensual non-monogamy because they're pulled in by this allure of the fantasy of, maybe I could have multiple partners and wouldn't that feel great? The reality, the practical reality, is not always so simple,
Mm-hmm.
and very rarely does it match up to the fantasy of it.
Mm-hmm. And that's why I find your work so compelling, both as a coach and what you advocate for, because you kind of you're acting as a navigator into a potentially really helpful healing kind of new rethink around relationships. And I wonder if we could actually kind of dive a little bit deeper into your work and what you do. How do you help people make that kind of first step into either opening up a long-term relationship, a marriage, or if you're single and wanting to redefine, how you approach intimacy, what's the first step?
Mhm. The three questions that I ask everybody when I'm teaching and when I'm coaching are what, why, and where. The what is about what kind of non-monogamy is it that you're wanting to explore? What is it that is inspiring you onto this path? And often I will go through different forms like we've already done. So we talked about swinging, we talked about polyamory, there's relationship anarchy. There's different subsets of all these different things. Like you could be in a polyfidelitous relationship. So you have multiple partners, but you're exclusive with those partners. Maybe you have long distance relationships. Maybe you want to live in a commune. Maybe you want to just be an ethical slut. There's all these different approaches. So we look at what kind of non-monogamy is appealing to you right now. And then the second question is why? Why is it that you feel that's going to meet your needs? Why is it that this is inspiring you? And this is looking at, am I wanting to actively challenge society's default trajectory for myself? Am I wanting to break out of the confines of a relationship that's been unsatisfying for me? Am I wanting to share my love with more people? Are there specific sexual desires that my existing partner is not able to meet for me? So on and so forth. We examine the why. And then the where is about where is it going? So where do you envision this path taking you in 5 to 10 years? And that's important because some people will decide that they're going to explore non-monogamy on a whim, like while waiting to get into Burning Man or on their way to a festival, which, great. That could actually be a great place to explore that. But do you want to continue exploring that when the festival is done? And so having a sense of where do you want this to go, I think is important. Very important if you have children or considering having children or raising a family with anybody. Very important to consider in terms of, how that might impact the work that you do or your life or the people around you in your life. So that where is it going to go for you is very important. And sort of implicit within those three questions is this examination of how we resource ourselves for safety, security, and stability. Because, like I said, monogamy is a very popular strategy for creating safety, security, and stability. And as soon as we start to challenge that, whether you're in a relationship already or not, as soon as we start to challenge that, we can feel very unsafe. We can feel very destabilized. A lot of people experience the process of opening up as overwhelming. It floods their nervous system. People find themselves wrestling with jealousy and insecurities and self-doubt and imposter syndrome and all sorts of other questions that they'd never in a million years thought that they were going to have to ask themselves. And that is challenging. It's like learning an entirely new language. You're learning a whole new operating system for your own self.
So I imagine one of the first things that come up for people is jealousy. And, when I was reading The Ethical Slut, there was this term I think it was called compersion. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about working with jealousy at that initial stage.
Compersion is one of my favorite things to talk about. It's one of my favorite things to experience. And I think it's useful to talk about that before we dive into what jealousy is, because compersion, some people will call it the opposite of jealousy, but it is possible to experience compersion and jealousy at the same time. Compersion is that warm, fuzzy feeling you get when you see other people enjoying an experience, even though you're not part of the experience. So you might think of when you see a young couple in love walking hand in hand down the street. You're not part of their relationship, but you feel this kind of warm appreciation for what they have. We might feel compersion when someone describes to us a delicious meal that they've had or an accomplishment that they've made. And compersion within non-monogamous configurations comes into play when your partner is experiencing something with another of their lovers, and that experience doesn't involve you, but you can still feel really positive and good about it.
Hmm.
And there's a blogger, Zdena Love, who writes about 3 different kinds of compersion. So she talks about how there's erotic compersion, so you can actually feel aroused
Hmm.
by hearing about the experiences your partner has with someone else. There's what she calls somatic compersion, which is this like full-hearted, full-body warmth that you feel about knowing about or seeing your lover have an experience with someone else. And then there's intellectual compersion, which is that, intellectual knowing that your partner's having a good experience that, is different from the experience that they would have with you. And I find that most people are able to access one of these forms of compersion more easily than another. And so it's important to honor that and recognize that as we dive into understanding the jealousies and the shadow emotions that come up, because there's always some form of compersion that's accessible, or at
Hmm.
least almost always.
Mm-hmm.
Where jealousy comes up. So jealousy, I really have learned to see it as an indicator. Jealousy is what tells you that there's something you need that you're not receiving right now. So it could be an indicator that you're wanting more attention from your partner, or that there's a need you haven't expressed. Maybe you've been trying to telepathically express it, and that doesn't always work. So you actually have to go and use your words.
Mm-hmm.
But I think also I've seen people confuse jealousy with a feeling of unsafety. And I was actually in a discussion group yesterday where this topic came up about how we have a gut response when we can tell that something's off. We can feel when our partner is withholding something or is telling us an untruth. And there's a somatic response that our body can have to that. And we can interpret that as being jealousy. But it may not actually be jealousy. It may actually be that we're picking up on something is not right.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's very important to listen to that jealousy can sometimes be an indicator that not everything is safe right now. And to go and look at how do I need to adjust things so that I can feel safe in this moment to engage, or how can I invite my partner to support me in increasing and enhancing the feeling of safety between us right now.
Mm-hmm. Part of envisioning this kind of new realm of relationship is having this kind of long arc vision, 10 or 5-10 years. I'm actually thinking, one of the biggest obstacles for me in terms of adopting a more honest non-monogamy approach is just really considering, is this something I can age?
Yeah, I think that non-monogamy is going to change shape depending on people's age because our needs change as we age. But what I think is interesting to look at there is that the reasons why people explore non-monogamy might actually increase as we get older.
Mm.
So there's a very sweet movie I heard about recently, and I'm drawing a blank about the name of it, but I think we're going to start seeing more of this coming out. A very sweet little movie about a, a triad in a retirement home, a man and 2 women. And I mean, if we look at the numbers, if you want to break it down into statistics, there are fewer men who survive into old age than women. And I think, and I mean, way fewer transgender and gender variant people. But if we're talking strictly about hetero relationships, there's actually a lot that goes on in retirement homes.
Apparently, yes.
I've heard little anecdotes about STI outbreaks
Yeah.
trying to be covered up because the families are going to be too embarrassed if they find out that, oh, well, grandpa's got cold sores suddenly for the first time. And And so, the reasons why we might pursue non-monogamy can change. And I think as well, one of the things that I've experienced in participating in a lot of intentional communities is that there's a kind of letting go of the concepts of what a relationship is supposed to be that increases as we get older.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's sometimes people who are, in their 50s, 60s, 70s can sometimes be more willing to challenge the paradigm because they've had a lot of experience of the monogamous paradigm not working for them.
Mm-hmm.
And then it comes down to practicality of, one partner is actually, I don't feel good about burdening my one partner with my care, or I can't take care of my partner just by myself. And we want to open ourselves up, not just to random strangers coming into care, but like, what if we live in a village together of caring for one another? I know of a collective house down in Seattle where almost all the residents are 60 plus. I think one of them is in their 50s. And they're all non-monogamous in different kinds of relationship configurations with one another. And it's wonderful. I've stayed at their house, and definitely you have to bring your earplugs with you when you stay there. They had the neighbors knock on the door one night going, "We heard some noises. Is everyone okay?" Because the neighbors did not imagine that this house could be a home to wild, debaucherous sex, and everybody's mostly over 60.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mel, I'm wondering, and this is probably a good place to kind of wrap up. I'm wondering if people wanted to learn more about what you do. How can people get in touch? And do you have anything coming up that you'd like people to know about?
Yeah. So my website is radicalrelationshipcoaching.ca. And you can also find me on social media on Facebook as Radical Relationships. And I try to keep everything as up to date as possible on those two locations, the Facebook page and my website. And twice a year, I offer my monogamy detox course. So this is a 6-week course, but it's actually lifetime access. So there's continuing material and calls that happen through the year, and every time the course is offered live again, you can repeat it. And this is it's not necessarily a polyamory 101. It's more of like a 201 level, but it's definitely applicable for people who are looking to do conscious monogamy, or people who are just starting to question how they're doing relationships. And it's really designed to address all the concepts that we take as default, as standard, and to challenge them and to empower each person with their own roadmap for how to navigate relationships in a way that feels authentic for them. So the Monogamy Detox course will be starting up again at the end of April. And if you want to know more about that, you can go straight to monogamydetox.com.
Well, Mel, thank you so much for this conversation. I really enjoyed chatting with you. I really feel that this has been kind of a very kind of we've done a flyover of a very vast territory, and I really hope that in the future we can get you back and start to kind of drill down. So thank you so much for joining us. Again, I thank Mel for this provocative discussion, and I invite your questions and comments. Head on over to awakenrelationship.com. Sign up for our newsletter. Don't forget to hit subscribe. And if you're feeling super keen about this episode, I'd really appreciate a review. So, until next time, stay connected.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Awake in Relationship. If you liked what you heard, please click subscribe to get the latest show delivered fresh to your device, or sign up for our newsletter at awakeinrelationship.com. Sharing is caring.